Many people assume The Day of the Triffids is just a quirky monster movie about killer plants. It isn't. It's a film held together by blacklisted writers, a director who delivered too little footage, and a second director quietly hired to save it. The plants were almost the least interesting thing about it. 1. The novel that started everything. Before there was a film, there was a book, and the book was something genuinely different. John Wyndham published The Day of the Triffids in 1951. It wasn't really about the plants. It was about what happens to human society when most of the population goes blind overnight. The Triffids were a secondary threat. The real horror was civilization collapsing without a single explosion. The novel was nominated for the International Fantasy Award in 1952 and went on to become one of the most influential science fiction books of the 20th century. A film was always coming. It just took over a decade to arrive. 2. James Bond's producer tried first. The film you know almost didn't get made by the people who made it. In 1956, Albert R. Broccoli and Irving Allen, the producing partners who would later launch the James Bond franchise, purchased the film rights to the novel. They hired Hammer screenwriter Jimmy Sangster to adapt it. Sangster later said he felt honored and a little intimidated working with Wyndham's material. He delivered his script. Then nothing happened. He was paid, never heard from the producers again, and later admitted he didn't think his own script was very good. The rights eventually moved on. Broccoli went off to make Dr. No instead. 3. The blacklisted writer nobody could name the screenplay credit on the finished film reads Philip Yordan. It was a lie. Yordan was a prolific Hollywood producer known for lending his name to writers who had been blacklisted during the McCarthy era. The man who actually wrote The Day of the Triffids screenplay was Bernard Gordon, a writer who could not legally put his name on a Hollywood production at the time. Gordon later stated that Yordan did no writing on the script whatsoever. The Writers Guild of America eventually awarded Gordon co-credit alongside Yordan years after the fact. But for a long time, the real writer of this film was invisible. 4. The producer was a frontman. The screenplay wasn't the only credit on this film that wasn't what it appeared to be. Producer George Pitcher was a retired film executive brought in specifically to satisfy a British government requirement. Productions shot in Britain needed a certain percentage of British executives on the books. Pitcher filled that quota. According to producer Bernard Glasser, who handled the actual production work, Pitcher had no real authority over the film whatsoever. He was a name on a form. It meant the film had a credited producer who wasn't producing, a credited writer who wasn't writing, and a finished cut that wasn't long enough. A production built on paper fictions from the start. 5. Howard Keel was the John Wayne of musicals. The lead role of Bill Mason went to Howard Keel, a choice that raised eyebrows at the time. Keel was famous for big-budget MGM musicals. 7 Brides for 7 Brothers, Kiss Me Kate, Showboat. He was not the obvious pick for a grim British science fiction picture about planetary catastrophe. He took the role and played it straight, but he was not happy with what he had to work with. Keel later stated publicly that the script was more of an outline than an actual screenplay, and that he was forced to ad-lib lines throughout production because there simply wasn't enough written on the page. 6. The film came up, 36 minutes short. When director Steve Seckley delivered his cut of the film, there was a serious problem. There were only 57 minutes of usable footage. The film needed to be at least 90 minutes to get a theatrical release. That left producers facing a 33-minute hole with no obvious way to fill it. The solution was to invent an entirely new subplot, one that hadn't existed in the original script or in Wyndham's novel, and shoot it separately with a different cast and a different director. It was a patch job, and it became one of the most recognizable parts of the finished film. 7. Freddie Francis shot the whole lighthouse. The lighthouse sequences, Kieran Moore and Jeanette Scott trapped with the Triffids, battling for survival in an isolated structure, were not part of the original film. They were conceived after the fact, shot entirely separately, and directed by Freddie Francis, who received no credit whatsoever on the finished print. Francis went on to become one of the most respected figures in British genre cinema. He shot The Elephant Man and Dune for David Lynch. He directed horror films for Hammer and Amicus. He was an Oscar-winning cinematographer. On this film, he was uncredited emergency help brought in to make the running time work. 8. Kieran Moore and Jeanette Scott were hired after filming. Ended. The cast of the Lighthouse subplot didn't exist when principal photography wrapped. Kieran Moore and Jeanette Scott were hired specifically, and only because the film was too short to release. Their entire storyline, the scientist husband, the trapped wife, the isolated battle against the plants, was created to plug the gap left by Sekeli's insufficient footage. Despite being an afterthought, the lighthouse scenes gave the film its ending. The discovery that saltwater kills the Triffids comes entirely from this subplot. The solution to the whole film's central problem was invented during a rescue operation. 9. The Triffids were pulled on trolleys. The Triffid creatures themselves presented a significant practical challenge. They needed to move. They needed to feel threatening. And the budget didn't leave much room for sophisticated effects work. The solution was straightforward and visible. The plants were mounted on low trolleys and pulled along from below the camera frame. In wide shots, the motion is exactly what it looks like. Something being dragged. The film knew this and shot around it where possible, using tighter angles and faster editing during attack sequences. But in several scenes, the mechanical reality of how the Triffids moved is impossible to miss. 10. The car scene influenced John Carpenter. Despite the production's limitations, director Steve Sekeli built at least one sequence that lodged itself in the memory of filmmakers who came after. A scene in which a Triffid closes in on a skidding car, slow, relentless, inescapable, was directly echoed 17 years later by John Carpenter in The Fog. The approach of something unstoppable moving toward a vehicle in distress became a template for a particular kind of tension. Carpenter never made a secret of his love for British science fiction and horror from this era. The Fog borrowed the geography of that scene with clarity. Sekeli's limitation-driven filmmaking had produced something that outlasted the budget that constrained it. 11. The opening inspired 28 Days Later. The hospital opening of The Day of the Triffids, a man waking alone with his eyes bandaged, removing the dressings, and walking out into a world that has changed completely while he slept, became one of the most imitated setups in modern genre film. Director Danny Boyle has confirmed that this sequence directly inspired Alex Garland's screenplay for 28 Days Later. Garland transplanted the structure almost intact, a man waking in a hospital, alone, to find civilization gone. The Walking Dead used a version of it too. What Wyndham wrote in 1951 and the film adapted in 1962 quietly became the DNA of the modern post-apocalyptic genre. 12. The plants inspired E.T. The Triffids left their mark in a very different kind of film. The plant designs from The Day of the Triffids were cited as an influence on the alien plant life created for Steven Spielberg's E.T. the Extraterrestrial in 1982. The gentle, organic quality of the E.T. creature's connection to plant life drew from the same visual language the Triffid designs had established 2 decades earlier. A film about murderous, carnivorous plants quietly fed into one of the most beloved family films ever made. The creative distance between the two couldn't be much wider. The visual lineage is direct. 13. The credited producer had no authority. The fake credits on this film ran deeper than most people realize. Bernard Glasser, who did the actual production work, went uncredited entirely. George Pitcher, who held the producer credit, was brought in solely to satisfy British co-production regulations, requiring a certain quota of British executives. Philip Yordan held the executive producer credit and the screenplay credit. He controlled the financing. But the writing was Bernard Gordon's, and the production decisions were Glasser's. Almost every significant credit on this film masked someone else doing the actual work. It was a production designed for the paperwork first and the film second. 14. The film barely resembles the novel. John Wyndham's novel is a slow, thoughtful examination of how society rebuilds, or fails to, after catastrophe. The Triffids are present throughout, but rarely dominate. The real weight of the book is philosophical. The film stripped most of that out. The social collapse, the competing survivor communities, the moral debates about who deserves help, gone. What remained was a monster movie framework grafted onto the bones of something much more serious. Wyndham's book asked hard questions about human nature. The film asked whether a man could outrun a plant. They shared a title and very little else. 15. The legacy outlasted the budget. The Day of the Triffids was a modest production held together with compromises, fake credits, and a lighthouse subplot invented to fill a gap. And yet, it endured. The BBC adapted it as a miniseries in 1981 to wide acclaim, and again in 2009. Amazon Studios acquired the rights to develop a new version. The novel it was based on sits permanently on lists of the most important science fiction ever written. The Triffids themselves became a cultural shorthand for unstoppable, creeping, biological threat. A word that didn't exist before 1951 is now understood without explanation. That is what genuine staying power looks like. Even a flawed film adaptation couldn't slow it down. 16. The credited composer wrote less music than the uncredited one. Ron Goodwin was hired to compose the score and received the main music credit on the finished film. His name is the one that appears on screen. But the official music cue sheets tell a different story. Johnny Douglas, credited only with additional music, a secondary billing that implies a handful of supplementary pieces, actually wrote more of the film's score than Goodwin did. Douglas contributed 26 minutes of music. Goodwin contributed 19. It was one more credit on this film that didn't reflect reality. The writer was someone else's name. The producer was a frontman, and the main composer wrote less than the man listed beneath him. 17. The director gave notes. Nobody could hear. Steve Székely was a Hungarian-born director working in Britain for the first time. He was, by most accounts, a warm and likable presence on set. He was also very difficult to understand. Howard Keel later recalled that Székely had a habit of delivering his direction in a thick accent and then walking away mid-sentence. Cast members would catch fragments of what he said and piece together the rest on their own. Keel described it warmly. The crew loved Székely and his sense of humor. But it added one more layer of controlled chaos to a production already running on an incomplete script, a budget that barely stretched, and a finished cut that came up 36 minutes short. A blacklisted writer. A director who came up short. A second director quietly hired to save it. And plants on trolleys that somehow frightened a generation. The Day of the Triffids was a mess behind the camera and a landmark in front of it. If this one hit differently for you, leave it in the comments below and subscribe so you never miss the next story hiding behind a film you thought you already knew.